A homeless woman rebuilt a burned church from ashes. She thought she was rebuilding her faith, not her fate. But when the cross cracked open, light poured out. Inside, $40M and a secret that changed everything. Elena woke to the sound of bells that weren't ringing. The phantom echo pulled her from sleep thin. Restless sleep in a shelter doorway that smelled of urine and yesterday's rain. Her body ached in the particular way bodies ache when concrete has been both bed and witness for too many nights. She was 52 years old. She felt 70. She felt ancient. Dawn was breaking over Amsterdam Avenue, painting the sky in shades of ash and rose, and across the street, St. Augustine's church stood like a skeleton against the morning light. It had burned a week ago. Lightning strike, they said a summer storm that came from nowhere, a bolt that found the copper steeple like a divine finger pointing downward. The fire department saved the stone shell, but everything inside had burned. Pews, altar, the wooden beams that had held up the ceiling for over a century. Now it was a husk, a monument to destruction, a mirror. Elena had been watching it every morning since the fire, unable to look away. She pulled her jacket tighter, a men's XXL from the donation bin, gray and shapeless, and studied the ruins with an attention that felt almost religious. The stone walls still stood, blackened but intact. The empty windows gaped like eye sockets. Charred timbers jutted from the roof cavity at odd angles, reminding her of broken bones, of things that had tried to hold but couldn't. The whole structure leaned slightly, as if tired of standing. Still standing, she thought. Barely. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, acrid and bitter. It triggered something in her, a sudden flash of memory so vivid she tasted it. Burnt paper, the chemical stink of melting plastic binders, her hands black with soot as she'd tried to salvage files from her office after they'd cleaned it out. How long ago? 3 years? 4? Time had lost its architecture. She closed her eyes, but that made it worse. Behind her eyelids, courtroom doors closing with that pneumatic hiss. Her lawyer's face, carefully neutral. The judge's voice, almost kind, explaining consequences, negligence, professional misconduct, suspension of licensure. Her husband's back as he walked away down the courthouse steps, their daughter's hand in his, neither of them looking back. Elena opened her eyes. The church was still there, still broken, still somehow familiar. A church bell rang somewhere in the distance, a real one this time, calling the faithful to morning mass. The sound carved through her chest. She remembered when she'd had somewhere to be in the mornings, when alarm clocks and coffee and purpose had structured her days. She'd been an architect once. She'd built things. She'd made structures rise from blueprints and belief, had turned empty lots into schools, houses, community centers. She'd been someone who created shelter. Now she needed shelter. The irony tasted like ash. Elena stood, joints protesting, and crossed the empty street without checking for traffic. There wasn't any. This neighborhood woke slowly. The caution tape around the church perimeter fluttered in the morning breeze, yellow and cheerful, obscenely bright against all that black. She ducked under it without hesitation. If someone stopped her, what would they do? Arrest her for trespassing? She almost laughed. The church lot was littered with debris. Broken glass caught the sunrise, throwing tiny rainbows across scorched stone. She walked carefully, her donated sneakers crunching on charcoal and shattered tile. The smell was stronger here, burnt wood, melted plastic, something chemical she couldn't name. Her throat closed around it. She reached the wall and placed her palm against the stone. Still warm. A week later, and it still held heat like a dying animal holds breath. The texture was familiar under her fingers, limestone, probably quarried upstate, laid by craftsmen who understood that sacred spaces needed weight, needed permanence. She'd worked with stone like this before, in another life, when her hands had been clean and her signature had meant something. Something shifted inside her chest, not quite hope, but its shadow, recognition. She moved along the perimeter, examining the damage with an eye that couldn't help but assess. Load-bearing walls intact, foundation solid, structural damage, mostly superficial despite the dramatic appearance. Salvageable, rebuildable. The words formed in her mind automatically. Professional assessment cutting through years of deliberate forgetting. In the rubble near what had been the entrance, something caught her eye. A splash of color in all that black and gray. She crouched, knees protesting, and brushed away ash and debris. A piece of paper, no, laminated, protected. She lifted it carefully. A child's drawing. Crayon and marker, enthusiastic and crude. St. Augustine's Church as it had been, complete with blue sky, yellow sun, stick figure people holding hands in front of the entrance. In the corner, in a child's unsteady print, my church, my home. Elena's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing tears she'd convinced herself she'd forgotten how to cry. The drawing was pristine, impossibly unburned despite the inferno that had consumed everything around it. She turned it over. On the back, in adult handwriting, Grace Porter, age 7, 2019. 5 years ago, this child Grace had drawn her church, had called it home, had loved it enough to laminate the picture and keep it here somehow, and now it was gone. Now this was all that remained of someone's love, a drawing in the ashes. Elena stood slowly, the laminated picture in her hand. She looked at the ruins with different eyes now, not just destruction, not just loss. Something else, something that resonated in the hollow space where her purpose used to live. She had been someone who built things. She had been someone who created shelter. She had been someone who understood that sacred spaces needed permanence. She could be that person again. Not for redemption, she'd stopped believing in that. Not for God, she'd stopped speaking to him years ago. Not even for the community, who wouldn't know her name if she spoke it. But for this, because something broken, recognizing something broken, is the first step toward becoming whole. Elena folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into her jacket's inner pocket, against her heart. She had no tools, no money, no permission, no right to be here at all. But she had hands that remembered how to work, and a blueprint now crude, childish, perfect, showing her what this place had been, what it could be again. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze. And Elena Rivers, though she hadn't spoken that name in 3 years, made a decision that surprised even herself. She would rebuild this church, board by board, stone by stone. One small act of construction at a time. She didn't know yet about the cross hidden in the walls, or the fortune sealed inside it, or the blessing that would demand everything of her. She only knew that she was tired of breaking, tired of being broken, tired of watching everything burn. It was time to build something, even if that something was only herself. Elena returned at sunrise the next morning with tools that looked like they'd been salvaged from the same ruins she was trying to rebuild. The hammer was rust-spotted, its wooden handle wrapped in electrical tape where the wood had split. The work gloves she'd borrowed from a construction dumpster 2 blocks away were too large, the fingertips empty and flapping. She had a crowbar she'd found behind a hardware store, a screwdriver with a bent tip, and a determination that felt simultaneously sacred and foolish, like praying in a language you've forgotten but your mouth still remembers. She started with the entrance, where debris had piled highest. Charred pews lay collapsed across each other like fallen soldiers. She gripped the crowbar and began prying them apart, and immediately understood that this would be brutal. The work fought back. Ash rose in clouds with every movement, coating her lungs, turning her spit black. She coughed until her ribs ached. Splinters drove through the borrowed gloves into her palms. She felt each one pierce and embed, small stigmata of commitment. A burned beam shifted as she tried to lever it free, and the weight nearly crushed her. She caught it against her shoulder, held it trembling for 3 agonizing seconds before managing to angle it away. Her muscles screamed. Her hands bled through the gloves. She didn't stop. Each board removed felt like removing a layer of calcified shame from her own chest. Each piece of debris cleared created space, literal space, in the church, metaphorical space in the architecture of her guilt. She'd spent 3 years collapsing inward, making herself smaller, invisible, insignificant. This was the opposite. This was expansion. This was the radical act of taking up space again. 2 hours in, soaked with sweat, despite the cool morning, she heard footsteps behind her. "You're still here." Elena turned. An elderly man stood in the entrance, 70-something. White hair, a priest's collar visible beneath his cardigan. His face was weathered but kind, mapped with the particular lines that come from listening to confessions for decades. He carried himself with the careful balance of someone whose knees had started making promises they couldn't keep. She said nothing. She'd gotten good at silence. "I'm Father Michael," he said. "I've served St. Augustine's for 40 years. He paused, looking at the ruins around them. "Served. Past tense now, I suppose." Elena waited. This was the part where he'd tell her to leave, where security or police would be called, where her fragile commitment would meet the immovable wall of property rights and proper channels. Instead, Father Michael walked to a section of intact wall and leaned against it, watching her. Just watching. She stood there, crowbar in hand, ash-covered and bleeding, meeting his gaze for 3 seconds before looking away. "Continue," he said simply. So she did. For an hour, he watched in silence while she worked. She felt his attention like sunlight, warm, revealing, uncomfortable. But he didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't stop her. When her water bottle was empty, he disappeared and returned with a fresh one and a pair of newer work gloves, still creased from the package. "You know how to do this," he observed, handing them to her. It wasn't a question, but Elena heard the question beneath it. Her movements had betrayed her, the way she'd tested the beam's weight before lifting, how she'd identified load-bearing points instinctively, her assessment of which debris to remove first for structural stability. Professional competence leaked through despite 3 years of deliberate erasure. She pulled on the new gloves without answering. "St. Augustine's was founded in 1889, Father Michael said, settling himself on a section of stone that had once been the baptismal font. "Built by a man named Thomas Brennan, industrialist, made his fortune in steel and railroads." He touched the scorched wall beside him with something like reverence. "He put his whole fortune into these walls. Some say he put his soul here, too." Elena paused, crowbar mid-lever. The words hung strange in the ash-thick air. His whole fortune. His soul, both metaphor and something heavier, more literal. "What happened to him?" she asked. Her first words all morning. They came out rough, underused. Father Michael's expression shifted something between sadness and mystery. He found what he was looking for, then disappeared. Vanished in 1890, a year after the church was consecrated. Some said he went west. Some said he died. The church was his last testament either way. His last testament. Elena filed the phrase away, though she didn't know why it felt important. She returned to her work, and Father Michael stayed, talking intermittently about the church's history, the community it had served, the generations baptized and married and mourned within these walls, the way sacred spaces hold memory in their stones. His voice became background music to her labor, comforting in its steadiness. By noon, she'd cleared the entrance entirely. By 2, she'd made a path to the altar. Her body was breaking muscles she'd forgotten existed, screamed protest. Her back felt like grinding metal, Her hands had bled through even the new gloves, but the space was emerging. The church's skeleton was becoming visible, its bones exposed but somehow more honest for it. She was working on a collapsed section of the interior wall when her crowbar punched through into nothing. Elena stopped, pulled the crowbar back, leaned closer. Behind the shattered plaster and burned lath, there was a gap. Not a crack or break, a deliberate hollow space in the wall's construction. She ran her fingers along the cavity's edges, feeling the intentional architecture of it. This wasn't damage, this was design. Something was inside these walls. Her fingers brushed metal cold, smooth, shaped. Iron, she thought. The texture of old wrought iron, oxidized but solid. She traced its outline, vertical, then a horizontal bar. A cross, she realized. An iron cross embedded in the wall structure itself, hidden behind plaster and paint for over a century. Find something? Father Michael's voice made her jump. She looked back at him. He'd moved closer, silent on old feet, and his expression was carefully neutral, too neutral, like someone working hard to reveal nothing. There's a gap, Elena said slowly. Something metal inside. Old churches have their secrets, Father Michael said after a moment. Relics sealed in walls, architectural reinforcements, mysteries outliving the people who built them. He didn't ask her to show him. He didn't come closer to look. He just stood there with that carefully blank face. And Elena understood. He knew. He'd known something was hidden here. Maybe not what, but something. The church held secrets in its bones, and she was rebuilding it, exposing it, bringing whatever was buried back into light. Elena pulled her hand from the gap, her fingers black with soot and something else, the cold residue of old metal, of hidden things waiting. Her heart hammered with exhaustion and something she couldn't name. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Anticipation, maybe. The sense that she'd set something in motion that had its own momentum now, its own destination. She looked at Father Michael, then at the hollow in the wall, then at her bleeding hands. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. Father Michael nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I think you have to be." Days became weeks, and Elena established a rhythm that felt like prayer even though she'd stopped praying years ago. Dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Sunday, she rested not for God, but because her body demanded it. Because even determination has limits written into muscle and bone. She worked with a methodical precision that surprised her, salvaging what could be saved, replacing what could not. Charred beams that still held structural integrity she cleaned and reinforced. Shattered windows she boarded temporarily with plywood she'd found behind a lumber yard. Stone she scrubbed, until her knuckles bled, revealing the limestone's original pale gray beneath decades of city soot and fire damage. The work became meditation. Each hammer strike a small act of atonement for sins she still couldn't fully articulate. The shortcuts taken, the warnings ignored, the moment she'd signed off on materials she'd known were marginal because the deadline mattered more than the details. Each nail driven straight felt like driving something crooked out of her soul. Her body changed. Muscles hardened in her shoulders and forearms. Her hands developed new calluses over the old scars. She moved differently, straighter, more purposeful. Like someone remembering they had a right to occupy space in the world. And she began humming, old hymns, mostly. Songs she didn't know she remembered from a childhood spent in a different church, a different life. Amazing Grace, Be Thou My Vision. Her voice was rough, underused, but it filled the empty sanctuary with something other than silence and ash. The acoustics were good even in the ruins. The stone walls caught sound and held it, made it reverberate like the building itself was listening. The community noticed, at first with suspicion. Who was this homeless woman trespassing on church property, working without permission or oversight? Neighbors called the police twice in the first week. Both times, Father Michael appeared and sent them away with quiet words Elena couldn't hear, but could read in the officers' relaxing shoulders, their departing nods. Then curiosity. People began walking by deliberately, slowing to watch her work. A woman with a stroller stopped to ask what she was doing. Elena gestured at the church rebuilding, and the woman nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense, as if homeless women reconstructed burned churches every day. Finally, something like respect. The owner of Riverside Hardware, a stocky man named Mr. Chen who'd run the store for 30 years, began leaving supplies by the church fence. A box of nails, a package of sandpaper, a coil of electrical wire with a note, found extra in the back. Elena knew he was lying. She took the supplies anyway, each gift a small miracle she didn't feel she deserved. A retired carpenter named Bill stopped one afternoon, watched her struggling with a rotted window frame, and said, "You're doing that backwards." He showed her the right way. The next day he returned with his own tools and worked beside her for an hour, then 2 hours. By the end of the week, he was coming every afternoon, teaching her tricks he'd learned over 5 decades of construction work, telling her stories about the neighborhood, never once asking her name or where she slept at night. A woman, Rosa, who lived in the brownstone across the street, brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "You need to eat," she said simply, and left before Elena could refuse or thank her. No one asked Elena's story. Her work spoke louder than any words could. But at night, lying in the church itself now, she'd stopped going back to the shelter, had made a corner of the sacristy her sleeping space, with a sleeping bag someone had left by the fence and the child's drawing tacked to the wall. Elena obsessed over the hidden cavity. She sketched it by candlelight, trying to map what she remembered of its dimensions and position. During the day, between other tasks, she carefully removed more debris around it, revealing that the hollow space ran deeper than she'd initially thought. Not a gap, a chamber, deliberately sealed behind layers of brick and mortar, part of the original 1,889 construction. The iron cross she'd felt was larger than her hand, embedded in the wall itself like a secret spine holding the building's true weight. She traced its outline through the remaining plaster, feeling the vertical post, the crossbar, the precision of its placement. This wasn't decorative. This was structural, foundational. It meant something. On the 4th week, Father Michael brought her a cardboard box, its edges softened by decades of storage. "Records from the basement safe," he said, setting it on a salvaged pew. "Photographs? Blueprints? Ledgers? If you're going to rebuild her, you should know her." That night, Elena spread the documents across the altar, the stone surface she'd spent 3 days scrubbing clean, and studied them by candlelight. The photographs were sepia-toned, frozen moments from 1,889. The church under construction, Thomas Brennan standing proudly before it in a dark suit, workers positioning the cornerstone. The blueprints were meticulous, drawn by hand with architect's precision that Elena recognized and envied. Someone had cared deeply about every measurement, every angle, every symbolic detail. The ledgers documented expenses: limestone from the Hudson Valley quarries, timber from upstate, labor costs, material invoices. Brennan had spared nothing. The total expenditure made Elena's breath catch even accounting for $1,889. It was a fortune. Father Michael's words echoed. He put his whole fortune into these walls. She was about to close the ledger when she noticed something tucked in the back, a loose page, the handwriting different from the accounting entries. Personal, a note, dated the 15th of December, 1889, in Thomas Brennan's own hand. "Let the foundation hold what heaven hides. Let the finder prove worthy of the finding. Not all treasures are meant for taking. Some are meant for testing. Elena's hands trembled as she read it once, twice, 3 times. Her architect's mind analyzed the words like a blueprint foundation: hold, hidden, worthy, finding, testing. Each word deliberate, each word a clue. Something was hidden in this church, hidden in the foundation, hidden behind walls, hidden in that iron cross she'd been circling for weeks, like a planet caught in gravitational pull. And whoever found it would be tested. She looked around the sanctuary at the progress she'd made, the slow transformation from ruin to structure, the way candlelight made the stone walls glow warm and alive. She thought about Thomas Brennan, who'd built this place after personal tragedy, who'd disappeared after finding what he was looking for. Let the finder prove worthy. Elena folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket, next to the child's drawing. 2 blueprints now, one showing what the church had been, one suggesting what it might still hold. Outside, wind moved through the empty window frames, making a sound almost like breathing. The church was waiting, and Elena was afraid she knew what for. Elena stood before the wall for 3 days with a hammer in her hand, unable to strike. This was different from clearing debris or replacing burned wood. This was demolition. This was choosing to break what had been deliberately built, to violate the integrity of a structure that had held its secret for 136 years. The act felt simultaneously sacred and transgressive, like opening a tomb, like breaking a seal that had been blessed closed. What if what was hidden should stay hidden? What if she wasn't meant to find it? What if Brennan's note, "Let the finder prove worthy," was a warning, not an invitation? But the compulsion was stronger than her doubt. It pulled at her like gravity, like the church itself was asking to be opened, to be known, to release whatever it had been holding in its stone heart for more than a century. At dawn on Sunday, the church's holy day, though Elena barely registered the irony she began, the excavation was painstaking. She couldn't simply smash through. That would dishonor both the structure and whatever lay hidden. Instead, she removed brick by brick, cataloging each piece, stacking them carefully for potential reconstruction. She worked with archaeological precision, the muscle memory of her architectural training emerging like a second language she'd tried to forget, but her hands still spoke fluently. The iron cross revealed itself slowly. First, the vertical post, 6 feet tall, wrought iron, oxidized black as char. Then the crossbar, perfectly perpendicular, each joint precisely forged. As more brick fell away, she saw that each of the cross's 4 arms was hollow, sealed at the ends with lead that had been poured and stamped with symbols she didn't recognize. Religious iconography, perhaps, or something older. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. This wasn't something hidden quickly or carelessly in a moment of panic. This was planned, designed, intended. The cross had been built first, then the wall constructed around it, brick by brick, embedding it in the church's skeleton like a secret spine bearing invisible weight. It was magnificent and terrible at once. Elena's hands shook as she cleared the last of the brick. The cross stood fully exposed now, still anchored in the foundation below and the beam above, integral to the building's structure. She could see now that opening it, breaking those lead seals, would require tools she didn't have, and a decision she wasn't sure she could make. Her breath came shallow. Ash and brick dust coated her lungs. The hammer slipped from her fingers and rang against stone, the sound echoing in the empty sanctuary like a bell, like a summons, like the courtroom doors closing. The memory hit her with physical force. She staggered back, and suddenly she wasn't in the church anymore. She was in a witness chair, her voice saying, "I didn't know. I didn't realize. I thought the materials were sufficient lies she'd told herself first before telling them under oath, her colleagues in the gallery, avoiding her eyes." The plaintiffs, 3 families whose homes had been damaged when the apartment complex's balcony collapsed, watching her with expressions that mixed anger and something worse, disappointment. The judge's gavel, the suspension of her architectural license, the investigation that found corners cut, inspections rushed, materials approved that shouldn't have been because the deadline mattered, because the budget mattered, because her reputation for bringing projects in on time mattered more than the safety margins she'd learned to calculate in graduate school. Her husband's back as he walked away down the courthouse steps, their daughter Maya's hand in his 14 years old, confused, ashamed of a mother she'd thought she knew. The divorce papers 6 weeks later, the sale of their house, her name in the professional journals with words like negligence and professional misconduct. No one had died. That was what she told herself during the 18 months of legal proceedings. No one died, but lives had been shattered. Trust had collapsed. And Elena, who'd built her identity on creating shelter, on making structures rise, on the sacred responsibility of keeping people safe within walls she designed, had failed at the one thing that mattered. So she'd stopped being Elena Rivers. She'd walked away from the settlement money, signed it all over to the families, and chosen the streets. Chose to become no one, to be invisible, to live without the weight of that name and everything it had meant and failed to mean. She opened her eyes. She was on her knees in the church, cheeks wet, the exposed iron cross standing before her like a mirror, like a confession she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Jesus Christ. Father Michael's voice. Elena turned. He stood in the entrance, backlit by morning sun, staring at the cross with an expression she couldn't read. Shock. Recognition. Something that looked almost like fear. You knew, Elena said. It wasn't a question. No. Father Michael walked forward slowly, as if approaching something holy or dangerous, or both. I suspected. 40 years I've served this church, and there were always rumors, stories about Brennan, about what he'd hidden, about why he disappeared. But I never. He reached out, his aged hand trembling as it touched the iron. I never knew for certain. Should I stop? Elena asked. Her voice broke on the words. Should I leave it alone? Father Michael was quiet for a long time. Around them, the church held its breath dust motes suspended in shafts of light. The smell of old stone and older secrets. Why are you here? He asked, finally, not looking at her. I don't know. Yes, you do. Elena looked at the cross, at the sealed chambers in each arm, at the deliberate architecture of concealment. She thought about Brennan's note. Let the finder prove worthy of the finding. I was an architect, she said quietly. The first time she'd spoken it aloud in 3 years. I built things, and then I built something wrong, and people got hurt, and I lost everything. I came here because... She gestured at the ruins around them, at the slow reconstruction, at the cross standing exposed like truth extracted from stone. Because something broken, recognizing something broken, is the first step toward becoming whole. Father Michael turned to look at her then. Really look at her past the homeless woman's clothes, the dirt-streaked face, the calloused hands, seeing who she'd been, who she was becoming, who she might yet be. Some things hide until the right person comes to find them, he said softly. Maybe that's you. Maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you're not rebuilding this church. Maybe it's rebuilding you. The validation cracked something in Elena's chest, something calcified and heavy that had been pressing on her heart for 3 years. She hadn't been the right person for anything since the courtroom, hadn't been worthy of trust, or family, or her own name. But maybe standing here in this broken church with this hidden cross and this impossible task, maybe she could be. Father Michael squeezed her shoulder once, then left her alone with the secret she'd unearthed. Elena stood, wiped her face, and looked at the cross. The seals would have to be broken. The chambers would have to be opened. Whatever Brennan had hidden would have to be found. Not today, but soon. She was almost ready. Elena waited until night to open the cross. She told herself it was practical, fewer interruptions, no curious neighbors watching through the broken windows. But the truth was deeper. This felt like something that required darkness, candlelight, the kind of solitude that turns discovery into confession. She'd spent the day gathering tools, a chisel borrowed from Bill, a small sledgehammer Mr. Chen had left by the fence without comment, work gloves with reinforced palms. She arranged them on the altar like surgical instruments, precise and purposeful, then sat in a pew and waited for the sun to set. The church at twilight was beautiful in ways it hadn't been during the day. Shadows pooled in corners like standing water. The stone walls held the day's heat and released it slowly, making the space feel almost alive, breathing. Through the boarded windows, amber streetlight leaked in bands of gold that moved as cars passed outside, and for moments the sanctuary looked complete again, whole, untouched by fire. At full dark, Elena lit 3 candles and positioned them around the exposed cross. The iron threw long shadows across the walls, turning the simple shape into something more complex. More ominous, a key, maybe, or a ladder, or a door standing closed. She picked up the chisel. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in years. All the weeks of physical work had burned the tremor out of her fingers. She positioned the chisel against the lead seal on the first chamber, the right arm of the cross, and struck once with the hammer. The lead cracked. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty church. Elena paused, listening to the echo fade, feeling like she'd broken something irreversible. Then she struck again, and again. The lead seal fractured, fell away in pieces, revealing the hollow chamber beneath. Inside, oilcloth packages, folded and wrapped with precision, perfectly preserved despite 136 years sealed in iron and stone. Elena's breath caught. She pulled the first package free, heavier than she'd expected, and unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Paper. Old paper. Yellowed but intact, covered in ornate printing and official seals. She held it close to the candlelight and read, Pennsylvania Railroad Company, bearer bond, $10,000, issued 1,887. Another package, stock certificates for Carnegie Steel. Another, Standard Oil Company shares, dated 1,888. Her architectural and legal training knowledge she'd tried to bury but couldn't fully erase let her understand what she was holding. Bearer bonds and stock certificates from companies that had become giants, industries that had built modern America. These weren't historical curiosities. They were transferable wealth, valid if the companies still existed or had been acquired, worth potentially. Her mind did the math automatically. Couldn't help it. Hundreds of certificates, thousands of shares. If even a fraction had maintained value through mergers, acquisitions, stock splits across more than a century, tens of millions of dollars, possibly more. Elena's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the certificates into the rubble. She set them down carefully on the altar, her heart hammering, and opened the second chamber with hands that could barely hold the chisel. Inside, a leather journal, cracked with age, but sealed in more oilcloth, and a letter in an envelope addressed in careful script. To whoever rebuilds what I could not. Elena opened the letter. Thomas Brennan's handwriting filled 3 pages, small, dense, confessional. She read by candlelight, and with each paragraph, the fortune on the altar beside her grew heavier, more complicated, more terrible. Brennan's story. A man who'd made his wealth through ruthlessness, destroying competitors and communities, prioritizing profit over people. His steel mills had worked men to death. His railroad contracts had displaced families. His fortune was built on exploitation he'd justified as business, as progress, as the natural order of capitalism in the Gilded Age. Then his daughter, 7 years old, the same age as Grace, who'd drawn the church, had died of scarlet fever. And Brennan, standing at her grave, had seen his fortune clearly for the first time. Blood money, bought with other people's suffering, worth nothing against the weight of his child's body in his arms. So, he'd built Street Augustines as penance, put his entire fortune into the walls, literally, with a challenge for whoever found it. Let the finder prove themselves worthy not by keeping this wealth, but by using it to rebuild what's broken in the world. Let them be tested as I was tested. Let them choose grace over greed. 40 days you must work with your hands on what is burned, broken, or neglected. 40 days to prove your redemption through action. Only then can you claim this fortune legitimately. Use it to heal the world, or it will curse you as it cursed me. The secret blessing followed a prayer, half Christian and half older, words in Latin and English intertwined. A covenant, a binding spiritual promise that felt more like a contract signed in something deeper than ink. Elena read it 3 times, her vision blurring. Around her, the candles burned steady, throwing dancing shadows across millions of dollars in century-old paper and the impossible choice they represented. The solution to her homelessness was literally in her hands. The answer to her poverty, her exile, her years of sleeping in doorways and eating from donation bins. She could take this money legally. It might even be hers by right of discovery and rebuild her life. Get an apartment, reconnect with Maya, her daughter who hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. Maybe even restore her architectural license. Start over. Become Elena Rivers again instead of the quiet homeless woman no one knew. But Brennan's challenge echoed in her skull. Prove yourself worthy. Choose grace over greed. 40 days of work. 40 days of redemption through action. She thought about the balcony collapse, the corners she'd cut, the materials she'd approved, knowing they were marginal because the deadline mattered more than the safety margins. She'd built something unsafe and people had been hurt, and she'd told herself it wasn't her fault right up until the moment she couldn't lie anymore. She'd spent 3 years punishing herself, living on streets, becoming invisible, choosing poverty over facing who she'd become. And now this, a fortune that came with conditions, with a test, with a mirror that showed her exactly who she was and asked her to choose who she wanted to be. The woman who cut corners? Or the woman who'd spent 8 weeks rebuilding this church board by board, nail by nail, each small act of construction, an apology her mouth couldn't speak? Elena sat on the cold floor, surrounded by millions in bearer bonds and stock certificates, Brennan's letter in her lap, and watched the candles burn down. Outside, the city moved through its night sirens. Voices, the distant rumble of trains. Inside, silence except for her breathing and the church's breathing and the weight of choice pressing down like the weight of stones, like the weight of buildings she'd designed, like the weight of responsibility she'd tried to shed and couldn't. Dawn came slowly. Gray light through boarded windows, the candles guttering out. Elena's body aching from sitting still too long. She stood, joints protesting, and looked at the fortune on the altar. At Brennan's letter, at the iron cross standing empty now, its secret given up, its test begun. 40 days. 40 days of work. 40 days to prove redemption through action. She would honor it. Not because she believed in Brennan's God or his blessing or his century-old covenant, but because the choice was hers now, and choosing to be tested was itself a kind of grace. She would continue rebuilding. She would see who she became. And in 40 days, she would decide what to do with a fortune she didn't deserve but had been trusted to find. The church held its breath. Elena picked up her hammer. There was work to do. The news spread like water through cracked stones, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Elena had told only Father Michael, but in a neighborhood like this, secrets had half-lives measured in hours. By the third day after opening the cross, people knew. Not the details, those remained mercifully vague, but the essentials. The homeless woman rebuilding street. Augustine's had found something valuable hidden in the walls, something old, something worth money. The lawyer arrived on day 7. He wore a gray suit that cost more than Elena had earned in her last year of homelessness, and he smiled with teeth that had been professionally whitened. "Miss Rivers," he said, having somehow learned her real name. "I'm here to help you navigate this discovery legally. Property law, inheritance claims, tax implications, it's complex. I can handle everything for a modest 40% contingency fee. 40% of $40 million. $16 million for paperwork and phone calls." Elena, standing on a ladder installing a salvaged window, didn't come down. "No, thank you," she said. "Miss Rivers, you don't understand." "I understand, fine." She fitted the window into its frame, checked the level, adjusted. "I don't need your help." He left his card on a pew. She used it later to scrape dried plaster from the floor. The developer came on day 12. Cash offer. $5 million for the church property and all contents. Immediate closing, no questions asked. "You could start over," he said reasonably. "Get back on your feet. Isn't that what you want?" What she wanted was so much more complicated than that. "The church isn't for sale," Elena said. "Neither am I." On day 15, a woman appeared, claiming to be Thomas Brennan's great-great-granddaughter, with genealogy documents and a lawyer of her own. "That fortune is my family's inheritance," she declared. "You have no legal right to it." Elena listened patiently, then asked, "Did Brennan leave it to your family in his will?" "Well, no, but then maybe he wanted someone else to find it. Maybe that was the point." Each refusal cost her something. Sleep. Peace. The small certainty she'd been building that maybe this was real. Maybe this test was something she could pass. The temptations were reasonable, pragmatic, smart. Taking the money, or even part of it, made sense in every practical way, except the one that mattered. So she worked harder. Pushed herself like the labor itself was the proving ground, like every nail driven straight was evidence submitted to some cosmic jury. She installed new windows, real glass now, donated by Mr. Chen, who asked no questions. She replastered walls, working section by section, her trowel movements precise as prayer. She sanded and refinished pews that Bill had helped her salvage from the fire damage, bringing out grain patterns that hadn't seen light in decades. The church began to look whole again. Not perfect the budget was, still donations and salvage, but structurally sound, spiritually present, visibly loved. But Elena's body was breaking. Malnutrition, exposure, exhaustion, 3 years of street life, plus 2 months of brutal physical labor were catching up. Her hands shook between hammer strikes. Her vision blurred. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that was becoming skeletal. On day 23, she collapsed. One moment she was on the ladder, the next she was on the stone floor with Bill and Rosa crouched beside her, their voices distant and worried. Father Michael appeared summoned somehow and insisted she see a doctor. "I have 34 days left," Elena said, trying to stand and failing. "You have a lifetime left if you don't kill yourself first," Father Michael said sharply. The anger in his voice was new, born of fear. "Rest. Eat. The church can wait 1 day." But could she? Could the test? What if stopping meant failing? Father Michael brought soup instead of arguments, sat with her in the sacristy where she'd been sleeping, made sure she ate every spoonful, and then, in the quiet that followed, he asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Why can't you just take the money, Elena?" She was too tired to deflect, too worn down to maintain the walls she'd built around the truth. "I cut costs to meet a deadline. she said quietly, staring at her ruined hands. 3 years ago. I was the lead architect on an apartment complex, and the budget was tight, and the developer was breathing down my neck, and I approved materials I knew were marginal. Told myself they'd be fine, told myself I was being overcautious. The balcony railings standard residential code, but minimum spec, and I knew the building was near a university, knew it would be students, knew they'd pack those balconies during parties. Her throat closed. She forced the words through. One railing gave way. Second floor balcony. 4 people fell. Broken bones, shattered hips. One girl spent 6 months learning to walk again. No one died, but lives were shattered. Families lost their savings in medical bills. And I told myself it wasn't my fault, right up until I couldn't anymore. Father Michael sat silent, listening with the patience of someone who'd heard a lifetime of confessions. The investigation found my signature on the material approvals, found my emails pushing the contractor to move faster, found me cutting corners because the deadline mattered more than the safety margins. She looked at him finally. So they took my license, my firm, my reputation, my family, and they should have. I deserved it. And now? Father Michael asked. Is it your fault? Yes. The word came out like a confession, like a release. Every day, yes. That's why I can't just take the money. I haven't earned it yet. Maybe I never will, but I have to try. I have to prove. Her voice broke. I have to prove I'm not that person anymore. That I can build something right, something safe, something that won't hurt people. Father Michael reached out and took her shaking hands in his weathered ones. You already have, he said gently. Look around you. She did. The church, half restored, every board and stone placed with care she hadn't shown her own work in years. Work done right even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. 34 days, she whispered. I have 34 days left. On day 28, Claire came. Elena heard the footsteps and looked up from the pew she was refinishing to see a young woman standing in the entrance, 26, professional clothes, her father's eyes, and Elena's bone structure. 3 years older than the last time Elena had seen her, and somehow both familiar and strange. Mom, Claire said. The word sounded like it hurt. Elena stood slowly, sandpaper still in her hand, sawdust in her hair, looking at the daughter she'd abandoned through disappearance, if not intention. You chose to disappear rather than face us, Claire said. No greeting, no preamble, just anger and hurt wound tight together. You could have stayed. Dad wanted you to stay. I wanted. Her voice cracked. You just left. I know. That's it? I know? Elena set down the sandpaper carefully. What do you want me to say, Claire? That I was wrong? I was. That I'm sorry? I am. That leaving was cowardice? It was. She gestured at the church around them. I don't have good answers. I just have this. Claire looked around at the restored windows, the replastered walls, the evidence of months of brutal labor. Are you rebuilding that church? She asked quietly. Or are you trying to rebuild yourself? I don't know. Both. Neither. Elena's hands trembled. I'm trying to prove I can build something that won't collapse. That I can be trusted with something fragile. That I'm not... She stopped. Started again. That I'm not the person I was. Claire stayed for 3 days. Didn't help with the work, but watched. Sat in pews and observed her mother sand wood, install trim, move with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that attention to detail could be a form of love. They didn't talk much, but on the 3rd morning, Claire brought coffee, real coffee, from a cafe, in paper cups that steamed in the cool air. They drank it sitting on the church steps, watching morning light paint the street gold. I'm not ready to forgive you, Claire said. I know. But I see you're trying. I see you're different. I'm trying to be. Claire left, without hugging her, without promises, without reconciliation. But she looked back once from the corner, and in that glance, Elena saw something she'd thought she'd lost forever. The possibility that broken things might be repaired, that distances might be crossed, that time and work and relentless dedication might build bridges where none had existed. 12 days left. 12 days to finish the church. 12 days to become someone who deserved what she'd found. Elena picked up her hammer and went back to work. Day 40 arrived like a threshold Elena had been walking toward her entire life without knowing it. The church was complete. Not perfect, the budget had been salvage and donation, the labor mostly her own calloused hands, but whole, functional, reborn. New windows let morning light flood the sanctuary in bands of gold. Replastered walls bore the texture of careful work. The pews she and Bill had refinished gleamed with oil and attention. The stone floor she'd scrubbed for weeks revealed its original pattern. A labyrinth leading to the altar. A path walked by generations of feet, seeking something they couldn't name. Elena stood at the center of that labyrinth at dawn, alone except for the bearer bonds and certificates spread across the altar like an offering or an accusation. She'd counted them the night before final tally. Precise accounting, the architect in her needing exact numbers. $43 million. Adjusted for stock splits and corporate mergers, and 136 years of compound growth. $43 million that could end her homelessness, restore her life, rebuild everything she'd lost. By the terms of Brennan's blessing, she had fulfilled the covenant. 40 days of work with her hands on what was burned and broken. 40 days of proving redemption through action. The fortune was legally, morally, spiritually hers to claim now. No one could argue. No one could stop her. She sat in a pew, the same one where she'd drunk coffee with Claire 8 days ago and wept. Not from joy, from the weight of becoming, from the terrifying responsibility of choice, from understanding, finally, what the test had actually been testing. The 40 days hadn't been about earning money. They'd been about reconstructing her soul, brick by brick, nail by nail, just like the church. The fortune was secondary incidental, almost to the person she'd become in the rebuilding. Thomas Brennan had known this. He designed the test not to find a saint, but to create one, to transform the finder through the finding. Elena wiped her face with hands that were scarred and strong now, no longer trembling. She thought about the woman who'd woken in a shelter doorway 10 weeks ago, anonymous, invisible, hollowed out by shame and self-imposed exile. That woman would have taken this money and run, would have seen it as cosmic compensation for suffering, as the universe finally balancing scales. But that woman didn't exist anymore. In her place, someone who knew how to build things right. Someone who understood that shortcuts were never shortcuts, that corners cut became corners that couldn't hold weight. Someone who'd learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but a practice, daily and deliberate, built through small acts of attention and care. The blessing hadn't been in the cross. It had been in becoming the kind of person who could open the cross and choose grace over greed. Elena stood, walked to the altar, looked at the fortune that could change her life, and made her choice. She would use it exactly as Brennan intended, to rebuild what was broken in the world. The foundation documents took 3 days to prepare with a lawyer, a different one, recommended by Father Michael, who charged reasonable fees and asked good questions. The Brennan Foundation for Sacred Restoration, dedicated to rebuilding abandoned churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques, and to providing housing and construction training for homeless people willing to work. People like her. People who needed purpose more than pity. Who needed to build something outside themselves to reconstruct what had collapsed within. She kept enough for modest housing, a one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from Street Augustine's. Nothing fancy, and a small salary to continue her work as the foundation's director. The rest, the vast majority, went into an endowment that would fund restoration projects for generations. The irony was perfect, and Elena felt it like a key turning in a lock. The woman who'd lost everything by cutting corners was rebuilding her life by refusing shortcuts. Father Michael came to her apartment on the day she signed the final documents. Small celebration. Tea and grocery store cookies. The most either of them could manage. He looked at the papers spread across her second-hand table, the foundation charter, the bank accounts, the first project proposals already coming in, and asked the question she knew he would ask, the question the whole story had been building toward. Do you regret not keeping it all? Elena was quiet for a long time. Outside her window, Amsterdam Avenue moved through its afternoon buses, pedestrians, the ordinary traffic of lives being lived. From here, she could see Street, Augustine's steeple, rebuilt and straight against the sky. 3 months ago, she said finally, I would have killed for a fraction of this money, would have seen it as salvation, as the answer to every prayer I'd stopped praying. Now I'm grateful I didn't have it then. She looked at Father Michael. I wasn't ready. I wasn't whole. The real treasure wasn't in the cross. It was in being the kind of person who could open it and walk away. You didn't walk away, Father Michael observed gently. You transformed it. Same thing, maybe. He smiled. No, better thing. Walking away is renunciation. Transformation is redemption. Through the window, church bells began to ring Street Augustine's bells. Silent since the fire, now restored and ringing for the first time in months. Father Michael had arranged it, she realized, timed it for this moment. The sound rolled across the neighborhood like a voice calling the faithful home, like absolution given form in bronze and sound waves. Elena closed her eyes and let it wash over her. The bells rang, the changes, mathematical patterns, sacred geometry made audible, and she thought about Thomas Brennan standing in this same neighborhood 136 years ago, listening to these same bells ring for the first time, knowing he'd hidden his fortune and his test and his hope that someday someone would find them and choose wisely. She'd chosen. The bells confirmed it. The church confirmed it. The weight lifting from her chest confirmed it. What happens now? Father Michael asked when the bells finally stopped. Elena opened her eyes, looked at the foundation documents, thought about the abandoned synagogue in Brooklyn waiting for restoration, the former construction worker living in his car who'd applied to the training program, the mosque in Queens that had been vandalized and needed rebuilding. Now, she smiled the first real smile she'd allowed herself in 3 years. Now we get to work. Outside, the afternoon light turned golden. Inside, Elena Rivers, architect, builder, director of the Brennan Foundation, no longer homeless, no longer invisible, no longer running from who she'd been or who she was becoming, began planning the next church. The work was just beginning, and she was ready. 6 months later, Street Augustine's reopened on a Sunday morning bright with October light. Elena stood in the back of the sanctuary, watching the neighborhood file in families who'd lived here for generations. Newcomers drawn by word of mouth, the curious and the faithful, and the simply lonely looking for something beautiful on a Sunday morning. The church was full. Not wealthy, not ornate, but whole in a way that mattered more than perfection. Sunlight poured through the new windows, painting the congregation in bands of gold. The replastered walls bore the subtle texture of hand-troweled work. The refinished pews gleamed with oil and care. Elena wore clean clothes, still simple, still practical, but hers now, chosen rather than donated. She lived 3 blocks away in a one-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop, small and spare but stable. She was the director of the Brennan Foundation now, with a modest salary and a purpose that filled the space where shame had lived for 3 years. She wasn't wealthy, but she was present in her own life again, and that felt like wealth of a different order. Father Michael led the rededication ceremony with the gentle authority of someone who'd shepherded this community for 4 decades. He spoke about resurrection and renewal, about sacred spaces rebuilt through love and labor. He honored Elena publicly, the woman whose dedication saved this church. But at her request, he didn't tell the full story of the fortune hidden in the walls, the test, the choice. Some miracles worked better in silence. Some transformations were too private for public telling. The congregation sang Amazing Grace, and Elena's voice joined theirs, rough still, underused still, but no longer silent. The acoustics were good, just as they'd always been. The stone walls caught the music and held it, made it reverberate like the building itself was singing. After the ceremony, as people lingered over coffee and pastries in the fellowship hall, Elena felt a hand touch her elbow. She turned. Claire stood there, 26 and professional in a way that reminded Elena painfully of who she herself had been once. They'd spoken twice since Claire's visit during the 40 days' brief phone calls, careful and tentative, testing whether connection was possible after 3 years of silence. "Walk with me?" Claire asked. They moved through the church together, mother and daughter navigating the same space, but different memories. Claire paused in the narthex, studying the framed drawing on the wall, the child's crude rendering of St. Augustine's, miraculously preserved from the fire, now mounted behind glass like a relic. "This was your blueprint?" Claire asked. Elena nodded. "Found it in the ashes on the first day. A little girl named Grace drew it in 2019. She called the church her home." She touched the frame gently. "Sometimes you need to see what something was to imagine what it could be again." Claire was quiet, processing layers of meaning Elena hadn't intended but couldn't deny. Then she did something that made Elena's breath catch. She took her mother's hand. The gesture was tentative, brief, but real. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," Claire said softly. "The leaving, the silence. 3 years of not knowing if you were alive or dead. That still hurts. I know, but I can see who you're becoming." Claire squeezed once, then let go. "I can see you're trying. That counts for something." Elena accepted this grace, imperfect, incomplete, utterly real. Forgiveness would come slowly, if it came at all. Reconciliation would be built board by board, conversation by conversation, the same way she'd rebuilt the church. Some distances required time to cross, some foundations took years to lay properly. "Thank you," Elena whispered. Claire nodded and left to catch her train back to the city. And Elena stood in the narthex, holding the weight of partial reconciliation like something precious and fragile, like a structure still under construction but already showing its eventual shape. The following week, Elena traveled to Brooklyn to visit the Foundation's first project. An abandoned synagogue destroyed by arson 2 years prior, now being rebuilt by a team of 8 formerly homeless workers, trained and paid by Brennan's hidden fortune. She walked through the construction site, and the sounds were familiar hammers, saws, voices calling measurements, the particular rhythm of people working together toward something larger than themselves. She recognized herself in their faces, the concentration, the careful precision, the way they touched the old stone with something like reverence. People rebuilding buildings and themselves simultaneously. The cycle Thomas Brennan had begun 136 years ago continuing, multiplying grace across generations like compound interest on a very different kind of investment. The secret blessing hadn't been hidden for one person. It had been hidden for hundreds, for everyone who would benefit from the Foundation's work across decades, maybe centuries to come. Brennan had understood something profound. That redemption wasn't a transaction, but a contagion. spreading from one transformed life to another, like light passing through windows. Late that night, Elena returned to Street Augustines alone. She had her own key now, the first key to anything she'd owned in 3 years. The church was dark and quiet, holding its breath between services. She didn't turn on the lights, just stood in the sanctuary, letting her eyes adjust, watching moonlight paint silver patterns across the floor. She walked to the interior wall where the iron cross had been embedded, now replastered and smooth. The hollow space filled in but somehow still present memory and meaning occupying the empty place. She placed her palm against the wall, feeling the slight warmth of stone that had held sun all day. "Thank you," she said quietly, speaking to Thomas Brennan across 136 years, across the divide between the living and the dead, across the communion of broken people seeking wholeness. "Thank you for knowing that redemption isn't found, it's built. One board, one stone, one choice at a time. Thank you for trusting that someone would understand." She stood there for a long time, hand against the wall, feeling the church breathe around her. Then she turned off the sanctuary lights and walked to the entrance. At the door, she paused and looked back. The church sat in darkness, but it wasn't empty. It held all the work and prayer and dedication that had gone into rebuilding it. It held Grace Porter's drawing and Thomas Brennan's test and Elena's own transformation from invisible homeless woman to architect of grace. It held the promise that broken things could be made whole, that what burned could rise again, that people who'd lost everything could find themselves in the act of rebuilding something outside themselves. Elena stepped out into the October night. The door closed softly behind her. A street lamp illuminated her face, weathered now, marked by 3 years of streets and 2 months of brutal labor, but peaceful, whole in a way that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with integration, with becoming someone who could hold both past failure and present redemption without breaking. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking steady, purposeful, carrying her past like a foundation, the necessary weight that let her build something stable, something lasting, something true. Above her, Street Augustine's steeple rose against the stars, straight and solid, a structure rebuilt right, a testament to what's possible when broken things recognize broken things and choose, together, to become whole. The work continued. The grace multiplied. The blessing spread like light through windows, illuminating spaces that had been dark too long. And Elena Rivers, architect, builder, keeper of Thomas Brennan's secret, no longer homeless, no longer invisible, no longer defined by the worst things she'd ever done, walked home through streets that finally felt like hers, carrying in her chest the truth she'd discovered in ash and stone and iron, that what we rebuild in the world can rebuild us within. That redemption is architecture. That sometimes the greatest fortune we can find is becoming the kind of person who can walk away from fortune. The church bells would ring again tomorrow. The work would continue. The foundation would spread its grace across cities and years. But tonight, Elena simply walked home, whole and human and enough. Sometimes we rebuild the world to remember how to rebuild ourselves. The greatest treasures aren't found in walls, they're discovered in our hands as we work, in our hearts as we choose grace over greed. Redemption isn't a destination, it's architecture. One board, one stone, one choice at a time, until you realize the structure you've been reconstructing isn't just the building, it's you.